Hey friends, this is Pastor Dan, and this is the last video of our 13-week journey together, Parables for Precious People. And actually, I guess it's not 13 weeks, it may have been 11 or 12 because you've done a few lessons in the course of 1 week. But in these 13 studies, we hope that it has been a real blessing for you and a real help for you. And thanks so much for being a part of this journey with me. Now here is the last parable. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is really one of the great favorite parables ever. Now you'll get a chance to dive into what the parable says, but really so much of this parable is about understanding who is our neighbor. And that is huge. Because after all, Jesus said the two great commandments are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. That's the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, in the Bible, we have several different instances where Jesus is teaching us about the great commandments and about who our neighbor is. One is in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. But in this one, we find it's from Luke's 10th chapter and roughly verse 21 and following. So the way this story works is that someone is basically trying to question Jesus, and maybe it's not for the best of motives, but when they're asking Jesus about what the great commandment is, he tells them, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength. But the second is to love your neighbor as yourself, and at that point, the question's asked. Well, who is my neighbor? Now, that could have almost been a trap question. Because if Jesus would have said, well, the Romans are your neighbor, then the Jewish leadership could say, oh, well, you're not much of a patriot of Israel. Don't you know that the Romans are occupying us? And the Romans don't like us? And if you're calling them neighbor, then are you in league with the Romans? And that could get Jesus in trouble, of course, right? Well, that's not what ended up happening. Jesus basically answered the question with a great story and then his own question himself. And the story of the Good Samaritan is beautiful because what happens in the story is that here's one man in great need. He's beaten up so bad that he's literally half dead. Now, at that point, you would hope someone would go and help him, but even despite the fact that many people would travel along the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, they just passed by and they ignored him. And two that ignored him were two people that were thought of to be some of the most righteous in all of Israel, a priest and a Levite. They just ignored him. And who knows, maybe they had some really pressing matters. We don't know. But, we tend to think that if someone is really, really beaten up bad and maybe to the point of death, is there really more of a pressing matter than that? And that's a pretty good argument. In our own United States, we have what are called Good Samaritan laws, which means that if someone is in great distress, you can't just pass by. If you knowingly see that they're in need and you pass by, you could actually get in trouble with the law for it. Well, this is meant to encourage people to help where they can. But in the story of the Good Samaritan itself, we have two people that probably would have been thought of to help, who didn't. But the one that did help, he was a Samaritan. Now, who are Samaritans? Well, Samaritans were actually neighbors to the people of Israel. Their region of land basically bordered what is known as the people of Israel. But Samaritans were distant relatives that had so intermingled with other cultures that they were considered to be impure in their person and in their heritage. So much so that the Israel people and the Samaritan people were like neighbors who were, for the lack of a better term, like enemies. Now, this is not unlike, for example, if two countries in Eastern Africa were at war with each other, and really in many ways they may share same heritage, but they don't like each other. They don't like the politics of each other. In the United States, we have that problem. We have some people who are liberal and some people who are conservative. And in their beliefs, we're arguing so much about them that we're kind of in a silent civil war in our country because one brother is disagreeing with another in our own country, in our own land. This happens all the time. Civil wars happen. So the Samaritans and the Israel people, they were kind of not at war, but they really didn't like each other, even though they shared some of the same land. And so for the people of Israel, the thinking was, Samaritan, they're no good. But this Samaritan was amazing. Because the first thing he did was he saw the man. He helped bandage the man's wounds and helped clean him and dressed him. He put him on his animal, which meant that he walked while the man who was half dead was riding on the animal because there's no way he could walk. And then would drive or literally walk maybe a half a day or a day to the nearest inn in a very small town where he continued to give him help and then paid for his lodging while in the inn and then paid for several days of his upkeep while he had to go away until he came back in through town. So what the Samaritan did was not only help the man immediately, but provided for his hospital care for the next several days. Out of his own funds, out of his own money. Maybe could have spent maybe several weeks of wages just to help the man. Now, why is this significant? Because the prejudice of the people of Israel was that a Samaritan wouldn't do that. And Jesus is saying, oh, but people can do that. People across the world will surprise you. Your neighbor is anyone in the world. And if you think that someone won't do something good because they're from some country, or they have some skin color, or they have some perspective that you don't agree with, then you're not treating your neighbor well. To be a neighbor and to love your neighbor means to love anyone across the world just because they're children of God. Remember the banquet last week. In that banquet, everyone was invited. This week, we're studying how everyone can be our neighbor. And when we understand that, then we are in better position to go and therefore make disciples of all nations, which is the very last words of Matthew 28, verse 20. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I command you. And lo, I, Jesus, will be with you always till the end of time. This is great news. But that great news begins by understanding that we have a neighbor to love. And those neighbors are all across the world. Thanks so much for listening today. Enjoy your last study here. God bless you, and maybe we'll see you another time. But in the meantime, thanks for joining this journey with me. I'm honored, very honored to have shared this with you. Goodbye.